The room is quiet, except for the counting. A low, almost surgical murmur of adding machines. The drag of pencil led across paper. The soft percussion of fingers on keys. Outside, London is damp and grey. Inside, the light is clean and clinical. On the wall, a clock ticks and blinks. It is not a bank vault, not a church, not a court, but it feels like all three at once. Numbers arrive in waves, and each one is a reckoning. We don't count money, Mara says, eyes on the screen, hair pulled back by the fatigue of weeks that never end. We count the pieces of a year. The year breathes through her in columns. Roads scoured out of mountains, hospital wards ruined by the brown surge of a river, roofs torn open like paper envelopes, crop rows drowned and then buried in a quilt of silt. The words in her inbox are terse, almost tender. Total loss. Constructive total loss. Partial loss. Loss. Uncertain. She works at a global reinsurer, one of those quiet companies that exists like a shadow behind the places where people think the world is made. In truth, she knows. The world is made in rooms like this, where risk is transferred and the future is priced. The cursor blinks. The next figure clears. Another billion folds into a number so large it feels imaginary. But Mara knows the texture of it. This is the mud that stayed under fingernails for weeks. This is the smell of sour plywood and gasoline from a town that burned. This is the silence in a neighborhood where the generators finally ran out of fuel. Across the world, phones light up in the night like fish before a wave. A siren down the block. A family is awake before they understand why. Pushed by a low, slow wind and a full moon, the brackish water noses up through the storm drains, through the grates, through the places people decided water should go and the places it has been trying to return to for a century. Heat has thickened the air, loaded it with moisture warmer. Air can hold about 7% more water per degree Celsius, and here at the end of a swollen river, the sky feels closer than it used to. On the edge of a delta city whose ground is sinking grain by grain, Theo pulls his parametric jacket on as he runs. He's young, practiced, quiet under stress in that way only the very tired can be. Tonight, the clock on his wrist vibrates a minute before the city's phones shriek. He knows what that means. The tide is not the only tide. Up the coast, a storm drags its wet heel along a shelf that used to be colder. It is bigger than the old ones. Angrier but slower. It moves in a way the model said was unlikely and now call increasingly likely. How many? He radios. Too many, the dispatcher says. Outage on East. Clinic compromised. Water up to traffic lights at 9th. If you can get to the old school, they need wheelchair transport. Theo's partner scans the windshield and swears softly. That's inland. Not anymore, Theo thinks. He doesn't say it. They drive into a glow of hazard lights, brake lights, the bobbing strobes on the backs of scooters pushing higher. The engine hum runs up against the deep, dull wash of water moving where streets used to end. He can't see the river because the river is everywhere. Mara scrolls and reads. A preliminary estimate, a range. Economic loss of Retha. Smashed or swamped, insured or not, has been running into the hundreds of billions globally in recent years, a grotesque chorus of acronyms. EQ for earthquakes, WHO for hurricanes, WF for wildfires, CS for convective storms that spin hailstones as big as fists. Insured losses the part her industry helps shoulder are smaller but still historic, often breaking 100 billion, sometimes more. The rest is borne by governments, by charities, by communities, by quiet, private families, turning out pockets and selling heirlooms. They call the gap between what is protected and what is not the protection gap, and you can measure it in forehead creases at kitchen tables. You can trace it in bus tickets out of town. You can hear it in loan officers. Voices when they say a house like yours cannot be valued anymore because there is no one left to buy the risk under it. A father lifts a child from the bed as the water licks the mattress. Look at me, he says to her, voice flat to keep it steady. Put your arms around my neck and do not let go. The walls hum. The lights flicker and go gold, then ghost white, then black. Around the corner, a bakery's front window implodes with a sound like ice cracking on a spring lake. The smell of raw earth pushes through the neighborhood like a silted, living thing. The child keeps her arms where he told her and watches the refrigerator float absurdly graceful. A white whale in a small kitchen then slowly spin and wedge itself against the doorway. Above the warehouses near the port, birds wheel and bicker. The docks go quiet when cranes lose power. Somewhere a container shifts and another moans. A metal whale sound in the dark. Water keeps its own counsel. You can channel it, coax it, buy it time with berms and gates. But you can't order it to stop wanting low ground. People built in low ground with a confidence that belonged to a cooler century. Now things close down in a cascade pump stations, intersections, grocery stores, 911 call centers, running on batteries that were made to last for hours, not days. What does it mean for the world? A voice asked Mara on a panel 2 months ago. She answered the only way she could, with a story about a small town, a bridge, and a school bus. She said, "A flood takes a bridge. The school shutters. The grocery runs low. The mill idles because workers can't get there and inventory can't leave. Insurance pays the eligible claims. What's not covered is slowly eaten by savings. People move. The tax base thins. The town votes down a levy to raise the bridge because who would pay? 2 years later, the plant closes. That is one line in our spreadsheet that could have been 30 if the bridge had stood." The moderator blinked and smiled. The audience nodded like they were in church. The question ended there, but the story did not. In Theo's ambulance, the radio stutters. ICU generator compromised. Repeat. Compromised. We need manual support on the second floor now. They pull up to a building that has a long history of not waiting for help. Nurses have already begun lifting, moving, improvising, in a stairwell that smells like bleach and sweat and fear. A young nurse with her hair braided tight is hip-checking a door open while shouting vitals. A surgeon, older, formal, sleeves rolled, has his phone light clenched in his teeth as he ties a knot. You don't know where heroism comes from. Not until you see a janitor pull a bed up 3 flights with his belt. Theo puts his shoulder against the weight and pushes. He can feel the electricity shift in the walls like a storm building. The generator coughs, catches, stutters. In the parking lot, water slides under the ambulance tires and licks the fuselage of an idle helicopter. On the roof, someone has set flares in a triangle because that is what you do when you daunting. Know what else to do, and it feels like writing SOS on the skin of the planet. Bike in London, Mara watches the clock and thinks of the day a modeler showed her a graph. Seas rising like an uncoiled spring, the lower edge of the bell curve fattening, the tails running wild. Her role is not to be afraid, but to price the fear. She knows this year S number will be written in a language people have learned to read but not to feel. She wishes sometimes they could smell it, the way she can from here. On the second floor, the machine makes a sound. Theo has only heard twice the soft final dip of a wavering heartbeat and then the flat calm of silent sand. The generator gives a last rattling gasp as the lights go dark. The darkness isn't total. The glow sticks crack and warm like moss green and wet looking over, the hands moving through the hall. Phones are held high in a haphazard constellation. A nurse with a nasal cannula adjusts an oxygen cylinder with her knuckles to keep her gloved fingers clean. You can hear the whisper of air. The ventilator has become a shoulder-to-shoulder communion. For people trade off, counting breaths out loud. 60 seconds on, 60 seconds off. The rhythm of a shared lungs. The window frames shudder with the pulse of wind outside like a giant breathing through cracked teeth. Hold, Theo says. Hold. In emergency medicine, the word is a prayer and an order at once. Mara's screen floods with a different deluge. Images and the words that restrain them. Hail ragged as broken dinner plates in a field. A roof peeled back as neatly as a tin lid. A map shading red along a valley where rain stalled under a heat dome and poured out all that it had time to gather from an ocean primed with extra calories. Warmer air holds more water. A warmer sea feeds storms like a buffet. The science is patient with its own language, but the world is impatient with the consequences. Her colleague messages. Renewal season's going to be brutal. She thinks of that blunt word. Renewal like a ritual, a rite of passage for contracts that determine whether a household or a city can buy back some of its courage for another year. When catastrophe losses climb, reinsurance prices follow. When prices follow, primary insurers retreat. When they retreat, banks hesitate to mortgage homes in hot zones. The way you used to get the keys to a house was a down payment and a signature. Now it starts with, can anyone out there afford to share this risk? In a parched, western valley, thousands of miles away, school principal Janelle closes a file cabinet and locks it as if the act could stop the air itself from going brittle. On the horizon, smoke has started to lift and draw lines in the sky like someone writing. The wind is erratic, hot, with an intent she recognizes because she has watched it before. 10 days since rain. 2 years since rain felt like what it used to. A winter of deep snow gave to a spring of water running too fast to soak. Now the hills that were green at dawn, sunbaked to tinder by afternoon. The forecast uses phrases that don't sound like weather. Red flag, pyrocumulus. Ember storm. It doesn't take much more than a spark in grass so dry it crackles under your step. The town knows this intimately. Phones buzz during third period math. Evacuation warning. Jeanette locks the room as if gratitude could keep the door closed until morning. Her husband texts. They're moving the cattle to the north paddock. She looks out at the line of buses. She doesn't want to think of them as caravans. But every August lately, they look less like field trip promises and more like lifeboats. In a heat-flattened city, a flat with no air conditioning and no cross breeze and elderly. Woman holds her palm under the tap and feels the warm water pulse a heartbeat that can cool her because the pipes run shallow and the mains are hot. The mat on her floor has a picture of a pineapple and the word welcome. She looks at it and thinks of salt. Outside, the power grid is a metal meadow humming under a sky that never darkens fully because it is lit from beneath by urban heat. Utilities and metros across continents have learned new choreography. Rolling blackouts so transformers daunting. Explode like grenades. Demand response texts that plead in shaded stations where people sit with strangers under misters. Because the movie theater in the mall can shelter those who can afford a room of their own chilled by machines. When Mara was a student, a professor taught resilience, like a set of equations. Hazard, exposure, vulnerability, hazard getting stronger, exposure growing as cities stretch toward coasts and dry edges, vulnerability concentrated where poverty and poor planning overlap. She believed then that hazard was the only uncertain variable. We could choose to limit heat, to slow the melt, to halt the rot at the edges of the thresholds. Now she knows there are many uncertainties, but the one that shames her is the easiest of all. We still put people where water will go. We still rebuild where last year burned. We still pretend once in a century means once in our lifetime, when it now means once in a decade, then twice, then 3 times, as the climate's dice are loaded. Theo moves with a grace he doesn't feel. A volunteer hands him a plastic bag of dry socks. He is suddenly aware of his feet. He is aware of the hunger that lives behind his tongue. He thinks of his mother's recipe for soup and the window in a kitchen that is likely blown in by now. Because the house squats in a low place people took for cheap rent, even when the rent became not cheap. He could map the floodplain on a family tree. He tries not to. The radio cuts another voice thready with interference. Water treatment offline. Boiled notice. Citywide. Repeat. All tap water unsafe until further notice. He thinks of boiled water notices stacked like paper on a bulletin board that has no more pins. He thinks a notice is a public ritual, like a warning. It lets us pretend that information is action. But who has propane for the stove if the gas is cut? Who trusts what burns in the dark when it is the outside world? In a different time zone, a coastal mayor stands in a room with a mural of pelicans and mangroves and tells the city council there is no way to fix the road the way it was. Not with asphalt, not with more height, not with the same assumptions. We can elevate, he says. We can retreat in places. We can restore some of what we erased. Mangrove buffers, living shorelines. He uses the new phrases. Managed retreat, blue-green infrastructure, nature-based solutions. They sound beautiful. They also sound like surrender. A woman in the second row who has been on this street since her grandparents came by boat decades ago raises her hand and asks where she should go now. That her mortgage is upside down, and the insurance letter said nothing. The second letter When Mara visits her firm's modelers, she stands in front of a screen that makes the world look like a bruise. Purples and reds, where probabilistic models have stacked risks. You could pass a finger over a band of storms across the Great Plains and call them secondary perils, like a footnote to the primary theatrics of tropical cyclones. But those so-called secondaries hail, straight-line winds. Flash floods have become the unsleeping background thrum, and in aggregate they add up to numbers that are no longer small. The phrase secondary feels like a moral failure when you stand in a kitchen with a hole where the sky came in. In the dim hall, Theo and a nurse shift a patient to a hand-cranked bed that has outlived 3 administrators. There is a sound as if the building is clearing its throat. A boy across the corridor asks if he can hold his mother's hand. "Yes," Theo says. "Of course." The boy smiles like this is the best news he has heard in days. Somewhere below them, water presses against a door that was not waterproof because the building was drawn on paper in a decade when engineers measured different risks. Outside, the cabs of fire engines shine like the backs of beetles under streetlights. The sky is the color of a bruise. A text pings Mara's phone. Cat bon tranche. Tregod, the capital markets, have learned the colors of disaster. Money reconfigures itself into instruments with names that sound like new kinds of coral and fish. Catastrophe bond spools of investment cash that pay high yields unless disaster strikes, then pay out to cover losses are. Suddenly the most interesting party in town. 2 people who used to only think about equities or tech. It is a good innovation, mostly. It spreads risk. But sometimes you sit with the absurdity of it. People betting on whether a storm will be bad, while people decide whether to go into their attic for a last hour. She opens the message. Prelim. Parametric triggers met along the corridor. The corridor is a name for a place where storms often go. A parametric trigger is a speed, or a pressure, or a rainfall total, not a survey of individual loss. It's faster, fair in its own way, indifferent to anecdotes. Money will move quickly, because numbers moved quickly. Meanwhile, in a hall without electricity, people count breaths, because a machine that was supposed to count for them is dark and dumb and still. The building shivers again, and Theo hears a new sound, a strange hollow-wheeze of something structural flexing for the first time in a way it wasn't he meant to. He looks at the nurse. She looks at him. Outside, the water climbs one more step. The sound of wood going soft under pressure is not loud. It is a tear you feel in your teeth more than hear. In the stairwell, metal squeals lightly in a register otherwise reserved for an animal in a trap. The hospital is old but stubborn, and for now, that is enough. Theo helps move flashlights into a fan shape at the head of the bed, holds the beam steady with his thigh while he palms a pulse. 1, 2, 3 for the thready drum solo of a body concentrating on staying. The patients are breathing. The building is breathing. The city is swallowing and coughing and swallowing again. In the valley out west, smoke pulls over the ridge like heavy velvet. Firefighters call to draw a chimney. The fire understands the architecture better than people do. It runs quicker upslope, finds a canyon, and slams a freight of heat toward turbines that are meant to spin for decades. There are 25 houses on the far side of the ridge, built with good wood and bad memory. A woman stands with her garden hose and the conviction of someone who has won this game before. Ember drop looks like ash until it burns your palm. The wind makes its own weather, throws sparks like coins. Fire is a chemistry of mood and dryness, and today it feels like spite. In the school parking lot, buses idle in the shade. Children climb steps with their small backpacks and hold each other as hands the way adults used to hold theirs when planes took off. Janelle steps through the aisle making sure no one is left behind. Sees a lunchbox shaped like a spaceship under a seat, grabs it, and thinks. Remember. Mara pulls a file from the corner of her desk. Lessons from last year's wildfires. From the ones before. From the ones that keep redefining what constitutes a wild land-urban interface because the interface is blurred into a gradient. Risk-based pricing is a polite term for what becomes, in a zip code, a fast dividing line between who stays and who cannot afford to. You can harden homes, box in eaves, clean gutters, install ember-resistant vents, nuclear buffer zone, called defensible space and houses. Thus armored can survive in red circles on a satellite map, where you didn't think survival was possible. But all of that takes money, time, codes, inspectors, public education, political stamina, and a pause between disasters that fewer places get. On her screen, another message resolve. Ministry Eskimo Sovereign Kavur. She knows the file number. A nation whose coast is studded with resorts and fishing communities, whose interior is a patchwork of farms that depend on rains that now come in a seizure. The ministry wants to know, can we insure against the bad years? The answer is, some of it. A sovereign disaster risk pool can pay when wind exceeds a number or when drought tightens beyond an index. But the policy cannot protect against the creeping half-disasters. The salt pushing into wells, the quiet emigration of young families, the little theft of harvests each year, the loan that turns predatory because the collateral loses its certainty. On the coast, a bank manager looks at a map and tries to decide whether to renew lines of credit to a fishing fleet that knows the sea better than any model. They will go out. If they can, if loss hits again, the bank does not want to own boats or houses in a town everyone tells stories about, but no one wants to underwrite. He thinks of his grandfather on a trawler. He thinks of his board's risk committee. And his mouth tastes like tin. He decides something that will look rational in the minutes, but not on a porch at dusk. Theo swallows a mouthful of metal and heat and tries to quiet the part of his brain that is already writing notes for the after-action report. We need more portable power. We need a higher door threshold. We need to move the meds inventory up a floor. He knows, as always, it would have been easier to build it right from the start. He knows budgets do not smile kindly on things that might not happen. He looks down. The patient's eyes are open. He squeezes her hand. She squeezes back. This is the work. The power company sends out a text instructing customers to reduce usage. The irony makes a ripple through those who read it by flashlight. Across the country, another grid bows under a different extreme ice, where there shouldn't be ice. Heat, where there shouldn't be heat. Storms that draw lines between those with backup capacity and those whose backup is a cousin with a spare room. Grid planners use the past to predict the future. Now the past is a permission slip for a class that does not exist anymore. In the shadowed river corridor, the water treatment plant's intake is clogged with debris. Lumber, tires, a couch that looks resigned to its fate. Workers swing grappling hooks under drops of filthy spray. Somewhere in the mess is a tree that grew in a century when rain arrived like a friend. It bangs against the cage like a memory trying to get in. An operator calls for a pause. He looks at the river and thinks of his father teaching him how to throw a line. He has the sensation that the past is doing him the courtesy of a small visit. Then he turns back to work. Janelle's bus follows a caravan of red taillights down a 2-lane road cut through fields of gold stubble. The ash comes lightly at first, then thicker, then drifts inside the bus in a way that makes children cough into their elbows, because they were taught that courtesy in another catastrophe. Ahead, a sheriff's car blocks a turnoff, and a deputy waves them forward with a neon wand, like they were planes taxiing in a blackout. On the trading floor, where Mara sometimes goes to remember that money is a feeling before it is a fact, the screens go green when the rest of the world is gray. Investors look for yield in a sea of low returns, and disaster stops being a moral story and becomes a line item that pays until it pays out. She checks another file. Climate litigation. Cases multiplying. Arguments sharpening. If a court agrees that a company owes for what it allowed and knew, the cord can run from a smokestack to a flooded street. In her industry, liability is a whisper you learn to hear before it becomes a roar. In Deltag, a group of neighbors form a chain to move sandbags that are suddenly called sacks and suddenly seem ridiculous. The wall is already over. A boy waves a flashlight hopelessly at water as if it could be redirected by attention alone. A woman ties her dog to her waist with a rope and wraps her children in blankets that smell like the only safe thing left. Their own laundry. She prays, not because she has a habit of it, but because the old words make a channel in her mind that keeps the panic from spilling over. What does billions in disaster losses mean in this moment? It means a farmer sells a harvest at half price because the road is gone and the mill is closed and a predatory buyer arrived with cash. It means a nurse will leave this hospital after 12 years because she can tease sleep when it rains. It means a family will put their house on the market and accept an offer that will never actually be funded because the insurer will withdraw 2 weeks before closing. It means a city's bond rating acquires a thin crack that spreads across future decades like frost under paint. Theo hears the helicopter before he sees it. New rotors tick into place above him in his mind with the relief of an answer you do not dare hope for. Then a second, lower sound. Something heavy in the building groans. A sound like a long, slow sob. He looks up. Plaster crumbles in a light snow down into the pooled water at the end of the hall. Somewhere, a door gives way. The flood pushes into a new room, and everything that floated becomes confetti. A plastic bin slams into a bed rail. A chart swims. Pages blurred. The lights deepen from green to shadow. The boy squeezes his mother's hand like someone catching the end of a rope thrown from a boat to a dock. He whispers a question that is not a question. It's coming. Water takes the shortest path. Fire takes the steepest path. Money takes the path of least memory. When the door splinters, it does so with the resigned energy of something that has waited, and the waiting is over. The hallway becomes a river. Theo is already moving. Weight forward, knees bent. The stance of someone who has learned to carry and to be carried. He counts patience, counts lifts, counts breaths. The nurse with the braided hair shouts, names in a register that cuts through everything else, sings them almost, as if music could glue people to the world. The janitor loops a belt around a bed's foot and leans his full life into it. Downstairs, a mural of a tree is swallowed waist deep, and the bark seems to ripple. In the parking lot, cars tilt and find new angles that expose what rust had been carefully hiding. A man on a balcony smokes because what else is there to do with his hands? He flicks the ash into the dark and regrets it without knowing why. The ash lands in water and floats like a tiny raft. Miles upriver, a levee holds on the left bank and fails on the right. The reason is not moral. It is engineering and chance. On one side, a neighborhood floods. On the other, someone records a video and says, "We were spared aloud," and then does not post it. They sit with the knowledge that spared is another word for someone else's loss. On the plain, under a sky the color of backlit milk, a wall of thunderheads stands like a mountain range where there is none. A storm locks into place in a phenomenon the forecasters now warn about. Training. Cells move over the same place again and again, wringing themselves out like towels. Hail clots. In ditches. Cars pull over under overpasses, stall, then drift. Insurance adjusters will walk these streets in a week and ask about dates and times and receipts. A ritual that feels normal in a film, and cruel in a hallway where someone is still drying their wedding album with a hairdryer. A father in the wildfire zone grips the steering wheel with hands slippery from sweat and looks in the rear view at a dog with its head on a child's knee. The sky is lit by its own smoke. Sparks at the windshield and skitter like insects. Ahead, a checkpoint. Behind, a wall of heat that is less flame and more idea. A moving boundary between what will remain and what will not. The radio says the fire has slopped over a line. He laughs once without humor. Slopped. Like soup. Like a word for comfort hijacked by a thing that eats with no expression. In the city hall of a coastal capital across an ocean, a finance minister spreads out papers and explains to a room of donors that their debt service eats, their disaster response eats, their schools eats the very thing that makes their people capable of healing. He recommends clauses in loans that pause payments after a cyclone. Provisions that should not be innovative in a century of storms. A delegate with a sharp suit nods and takes notes. Outside the air smells like tin and salt. The concrete sweats. Palm fronds rattle like bones. Mara sits in on a meeting where the firm's head of property catastrophe draws a simple picture on a whiteboard. A house, a tree, a line. The line is the water line we used to expect, he says. He draws another higher line. This is the one we should price now. He draws another, and this is the one we'll see if the world keeps burning. He says it calmly, not because it doesn't matter, but because calm is the only way to make the next sentence. If we continue to write policies in this zone, the premiums must go up. He doesn't say what Mara knows. There is a price at which insurance is only for the rich. There is a price at which insurance is not a social good anymore. It is a private bunker. In the legal department, an attorney briefs cases, arguing that planning commissions are liable for approving subdivisions in harmless way. Cases arguing that governments are liable for not protecting when they knew. Cases arguing that companies are liable for emissions that made storms worse. The room is quiet. The risk is yawning, slow, systemic. It is also intimate. The attorney says, in court, someone will read a list of names of people who died and ask the judge to find approximate cause. The judge will search for a line between the shovel that broke ground and the wave that broke a door. Back in the hospital, the helicopter clatters overhead and then hovers. A rope descends, thoughtful and indifferent. The first patient goes up in a harness Miranda taught Theo to use in the training a month ago with a mannequin that weighed 60 pounds and did not whimper. This one does. These things matter. They lodge in the chest and will come back later in a grocery line when he is trying to remember whether he needs milk. In a small agricultural town, a meeting in a school gym hums with the electricity of history turning. The city planner, a woman in her 50s with the posture of someone who has stood through storms of words, points to a map taped to a wall. Colored lines show where water went last year and the year before and where it will go next. She is proposing a buyout. The town will offer to purchase homes at pre-flood value and convert the land to a park that will flood safely. A man in a cap stands and says his father built that house with his hands and he would rather die than sell. A woman cries quietly into the collar of someone's denim jacket. A child runs a finger along the blue line and says, "Why does it bend there?" "Because the land bends." His mother says, "Because everything bends somewhere." On a trading platform, a parametric payout lands in the account of a small Caribbean nation's disaster fund. The amount is not everything they need, but it is something, and it arrives within days because the ocean was measured precisely. That night, tarps move from a warehouse to a truck, then to a dock, then onto a boat. On that boat, a young man named Matteo counts palazzi and thinks of last year when they ran short. He mouths numbers like prayers. Mara thinks of the framework she has seen drawn in careful blue lines on white paper. The Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, which reads like a recipe for a world that remembers. The Paris Agreement, which is a boundary we pretended is made of steel when it is made of promises. The Loss and Damage Fund, pledged into being and then asked to fill a gulf much larger than its jar. She thinks of how unnatural it is to be asked to quantify grief, and then how natural it has become, and then how unforgivable. In the valley fire jumps the highway. Janella's boss pulls into a shelter that used to be a community center that used to be a gym. Children climb down and step into a room that smells like oranges and Lysol and human anxiety. A volunteer kneels, tape name on her shirt, and smiles with a practiced gentleness. A boy asks, "Do you have a charger?" She does. Theo's hands move without consulting his mind. A siren sweeps. Dopplers. Recedes. The rope takes another and another. At the door where the water came in, there is a momentary slackening. A sigh. Then a push. Outside. In the street. A car floats and nudges a signpost that reads nitrogen monoxide parking during flood. You could laugh if you hadn't learned what it costs to laugh. At the reinsurer's office, a spreadsheet cell turns from yellow to red as a threshold is crossed. The number that results is something journalists will call staggering. It will be accompanied by a photo of someone wading through a living room that looks like a swimming pool holding a plastic bin of their documents. Someone will say, "Billions lost," and someone else will nod like they understand, and another person will pour coffee and go to work. The number will not mention the boy on the roof who counted helicopters like stars in a coastal suburb where mortgages rest uneasily on foundations built in the last building boom. A bank sends letters rescinding pre-approvals because the insurer has pulled out of the market. The official language is apologetic, typo-free. It lands like a rock. A couple who have saved for 10 years and who have 2 children and a dog named after a cartoon character open the envelope and sit very still. They listen to the house creep like a ship. They do not say anything for a long time. Then she says, "We can't stay." He says, "Where would we go?" Back at the city hall with the pelican mural, the vote tally comes in. The buyout passes by a margin that surprises both sides. The room goes quiet in a way that feels like grief and relief braided tightly together. Outside, the tide is out, and the marsh at the edge of town breathes like a thing relieved of a burden. The planner sighs and folds the map. She knows what comes next. Appraisals, negotiations, moving trucks, a park ribbon cutting. That'll be sad, and also right. She knows what'll happen the first spring flood. The water will spread into a field instead of a hallway. She knows the people who left will watch it from a new porch with a view of another line of trees. Theo ducks through the stairwell as the last patients move toward the roof, and the building finally does what it has been threatening to do. A section of ceiling caves and drops a dynamic snow of dust. He closes his eyes until it settles, opens them to a shorthand world of headlamps and gestures. The helicopter shifts a few feet. The rope dips. Someone screams from a room that is no longer a room but a wet scroll. He steps toward the sound. The scream resolves into a name and then into a bird call of relief as someone gets an arm up and then another. Theo pulls a woman into a space that has become a corridor again by the force of human insistence. The rope is there. The harness is there. The helicopter is there. Wind slams them all against the idea of gravity like a hand. The woman goes up. Theo leans back against a wall that is sweating and shakes once. Hard. The way the body does when it stops pretending it is fine. He wipes his face and tastes the salt of a day that will not leave his skin. On the ridge where the fire made a cathedral of smoke, a line of hand crews digs and digs and digs, draws a brown edge and then another, orders pizzas to an ICP that will feed 100 people with 2 ovens, because normal comforts hold like talismans in a world that does not care about their small magic. The wind drops with the moon. A flank that had been angry begins to idle. Aircraft in the morning will lull people into thinking the fire went away. It didn't. It will smolder until the weather decides. But the school, the one with the dinosaur mural, stands. Embers nipped at its edges, and hardened vents and cleared gutters did what the town asked them to. They held in the delta. The water recedes with a grudging reluctance. It leaves a film of fine grit over everything like evidence you can taste. People come out of buildings with mops and brooms and the ancient knowledge of cleanup that our species has carried longer than any other job. Volunteers hand out gloves that are one size fits all and do not fit anyone. A woman tapes a sign to the door of a laundromat. Free wash for those affected. The line grows and the room fills with machines churn washing clothes that smell like strangers. The hospital smells like bleach and something else that will take longer to leave. In the stairwell, chalk marks denote who went where. A small shrine forms on a windowsill, a paper crane, a photograph, a sprig of rosemary that somehow made it through the water. The tally of lives saved will not be published the way the tally of money lost is. That is the nature of our ledgers. But every person in the building has a number in their head, and they will carry it like a bead they can rub when they need to remember why they keep doing this. When the city turns, the tap and water comes clear again. The Boyle notice falls with the same thump as a newscaster's voice, switching to sports. People will forget as fast as they can, because remembering is heavy, and also because forgetting is how we keep going. But the water won't forget. It has a memory longer than ours, an insistence written into gravity and temperature. On a dock in the Caribbean, Mateo straps down the last pallet. The sky is a bleached blue that makes boats look like moths. The radio crackles. The boat leaves with a wide wake, and the promise of tarps and tablets, and the quiet empowerment of people not waiting for handouts, but buying on a policy they paid for. A woman whose roof went last night waves from a pier with a child on her hip. The child waves back at the boat like it is a parade. In one sense, it is a procession of ordinary society choosing to keep working. In a boardroom, a bank votes to include climate risk in mortgage underwriting, not as a checkbox, but as a sentence with teeth. If you build here, we will not lend. Someone calls it unfair. Someone else calls it inevitable. Mara thinks the word is honest. It is also latte. She writes an internal memo. Mitigation discounts for those who harden. Increase coverage for communities that zone wisely. Partnerships with cities that commit to elevating homes and moving out of basins like bowls. She sees a world where actuarial tables can be instruments of social nudges. And then she remembers the force of markets and the gravity of profit. And she writes what she can anyway. The finance minister with the careful hands signs a disaster clause that will pause debt service when wind speeds or pressure thresholds are met. Next time, because there is always a next time, she'll stand at a podium and announce, within days. that the cash she needs to move neighborhoods back into schools, clinics back into clinics, roads back into roads, is there. It won't be enough to make everyone whole. The language of wholeness is not one the weather speaks anymore. But it will be enough to start. And that is the difference between a graph on the wall and the smell of soup in a communal kitchen. Inter Valley neighbors bring chainsaws to the first house that burned at the edge of town and make a clearing where a new kind of fence will go. Metal and thoughtful and less flammable. A crew from the next county comes with a chipper. The town council passes an ordinance that will make roofs less likely to carry fire. One person calls it overreach. Another calls it common sense. Janelle sets up a table in the gym with a sign that says counseling. She has learned that the quiet kids shake months later when a windshield wiper clicks a certain way. She orders ear protection for the little ones for next season, calls a grant program that will help buy generators for the school. She phones a teacher who lost her place and offers a couch. The teacher says yes, then cries, then says sorry. Janelle says there is nothing to be sorry for. Mara sits at her desk and closes a file that weighs nothing and everything. The tally, this year as in recent years, will be counted in the billions numbers that can make eyes glaze, that can make a story feel far away. She has learned to say it plainly and mean it. The price of our choices is not fully written on any balance sheet. It is written in where we build, what we protect, or we ensure, who we leave out. It is written in the fact that disaster losses keep climbing, not only because the weather is angrier, but because our fragile wealth sits directly in its way. She thinks of a different column. Dollars avoided. The sea walls that bought a decade of calm. The mangroves that took the punch of a surge and turned it into a slap. The home elevated 3 feet that a night's flood could not find. The coral restored that broke a wave into foam. The early warning that gave a village 2 more hours to drive. The community drill that made a lifeline out of a bus route. The teacher who taught a child how to count breaths calmly in the dark so when it mattered, she could help a stranger. What does billions in disaster losses mean for the world? It means a test of imagination. The tests we pass will be measured in futures made possible. Debt paused, coverage maintained, homes lifted, communities moved together rather than scattered. It means that loss and damage cannot be a ledger entry alone. It is a policy and a promise. It means the market, which is so good at adding, must be taught to subtract wisely. Emissions, exposure, inequality. It means we learn to price the future without selling it. Theo takes off his gloves in a stairwell that smells like lemons now, and for a second he feels the whole year tight in his chest. He lets it out slowly and watches it go nowhere, because this is the air, and the air is warmer, and we all live in it. He walks to the door and steps into a street that is already drying in places. In a puddle, the clouds move upside down. He can see his face and it older or wiser or just tired. Cannot tell. Across the way, a boy stands next to his mother and looks up at the helicopter leaving, and for a moment the rotor wash makes a tiny storm of dust that looks absurdly like snow. In 100 rooms like Mara's, people will spend the next months adding and adding, making a story in numbers that others will read in headlines. In 100 towns like Theo's and Janelle's, people will spend the next months sweeping and lifting and deciding whether to stay. Both are records. Both matter. One can make the other easier if we let it. If we decide that insurance is not a retreat, but a contract with ourselves to build better, if we choose not to let the protection gap become a canyon. At dusk, the coastal town with the new park floods gently, and a heron steps through shallows that used to be a living room. It looks absurd, then right, then beautiful. The planner stands on the edge and cries in the quiet way of someone who has been told to be strong for a long time and has finally been given back the right to be simply human. A child rides a bike along a path that was poured where a road used to sink. He rings his bell and laughs. His mother smiles and watches the water do exactly what it ought to do. Mara shuts down her computer. Her screen goes dark and shows her face ghosted in the glass. She presses her fingertips to the desk and feels the grain of wood. She thinks of a phrase a modeler once said. The climate has changed. The disaster is not coming. It is here. The losses are a mirror. They show us where we are weak and where we can become strong. We can choose what it means for the world. She turns off the light, and in a room in another city, A nurse turns hers on. A father opens a door and smells the river leaving. A bank manager signs a policy with a different clause. A finance minister stamps a document that will make a difference. A teacher unlocks a classroom and checks the fire drill chart one more time. Somewhere, a rope drops from a helicopter. Somewhere, it is reeled back in because it is not needed today. If stories like this move you, subscribe for more true events that change the world.